Good morning. I just want to remind you real quickly, if you're wanting to learn more about Shrek, which we looked at this past Sunday in worship, remember you can go to our website and look at the Pastor's Cut, and there I give you behind the scenes kind of fun details. And to remind you that this week in worship we're going to be looking at Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. The music will be incredible, and I think it's going to be a service that you will find inspirational. Today, I want to take just a moment to celebrate the fact that this week is an important week. It's an important week because it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being ratified for our Constitution. We don't have many amendments to the Constitution. They have to be really important. And the 19th Amendment was significant because it gave women the right to vote. What a significant amendment. And I find it stunning that we ever had to do it in the first place. It was Susan B. Anthony who really helped to take up the cause. There were many who were fighting for this, but she turned out to be a very significant person in the history of women getting the right to vote. She was born on February 15th, 1820. This was her 200th anniversary of her birthday this year. She was born into a family of great faith, people who were involved in social justice issues. Her father was a Quaker, but he really got into trouble with his church because he married a Methodist. In the end, he really got into trouble because he allowed dancing to take place in his house, and because he was an abolitionist. He was very anti-slavery. In the end, he helped to instill that into Susan. She too grew up, and at 17 years old, she was collecting signatures for petitions to abolish slavery. She fought very hard for the idea that all people, whether they are females, whether they are black, whatever, every human being should be treated with equality and justice, and everybody should have the right to vote. She really pushed for an integrated community back in the 1860s. I mean, she was so far ahead of her time. But it was in 1872 that she decided to vote in a presidential election. There in Rochester, New York, her hometown, she went and managed to vote. Well, that was against the law. And so they brought a charge against her. The case was the United States versus Susan B. Anthony. The judge had now been appointed to the Supreme Court. He's a political appointment. He had no need being a judge. He oversaw the case, never let her speak. In the end, he told the jury to find her guilty. It was a farce. And she was found guilty. She did break the law. She voted. It was a national case and brought all kinds of attention to the issue. She was someone who got out and she was traveling. Women didn't travel by themselves in those days. She would stand up and give speeches. Women didn't give speeches in those days. She was ridiculed. People said, "You're trying to kill marriage." I mean, everything you could imagine was thrown at her, and she kept going on. But she had a great quote. She said, "Do you not see that so long as society says a woman is incompetent to be a lawyer, a minister, or a doctor, but says women has ample ability to be a teacher, then every man who chooses to be a teacher acknowledges that he has no more brains than a woman." Yeah, it was unbelievable what women could not do. And she was trying to speak up to say, this isn't right. It was in 1878, that Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton managed to get Aaron Sargent, who was a part of the United States Senate, to lift up an amendment for women's right to vote. Of course, it failed, and it was lifted more times and failed. But the amendment became known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. She kept working for it, and they kept pushing. And it was fascinating what all was accomplished. In 42 years, or in the last 50 years of the 19th century, women finally were allowed to speak in public. I mean, I find this hard to imagine. They can speak in public. They began to have marriage rights. They had not had rights to be able to own property, to speak up. There became new marriage rights. Women were finally allowed to start going to college, though few were going in those days. Women began to hold all kinds of different jobs, though there were still so many that were barred from them being able to hold. It was finally in 1919 that we passed the 19th Amendment in the Senate and our House of Representatives in the United States. It then had to be ratified by states. 36 states had to ratify this amendment for it to become law. And it was Tennessee. On August the 18th, 1920, they became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And so 3/4 of the states ratified it, and it became law 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we finally said women were actually smart enough to vote. It's hard to wrap your mind around. But also a sad thing about it was it didn't say black women were smart enough to vote. So many black men and women were still barred from voting. It took the Voting Right Act of 1965 before they were allowed to vote. We've had a hard time in our country, in our history of our country, in believing that everybody should be treated with respect and be allowed to vote and have rights and be treated with dignity. And I thought it was also kind of fascinating to go back and learn, when did the different states ratify the 19th Amendment? It passed in August the 18th, 1920. But there are a number of states that voted against it. And they didn't come back and ratify it until many years later. Like Florida, South Carolina, they didn't ratify the amendment until 1969. Georgia, Louisiana, they didn't ratify the amendment until 1970. The last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, Mississippi, 1984. 1984. An all-male Mississippi Senate approved it unanimously. There were 3 women in the Mississippi House of Representatives. 3 women in the Senate and the House of Representatives in 1984 in Mississippi. They were 64 years late to the party. It's fascinating. It really is easy to want to tell other people how to live and not treat everybody with respect and dignity. As the disciples of Jesus Christ, we do better than that. We are called to do better than that. To truly treat all people with respect and kindness, and to believe that women, are you kidding, are just as smart as men and can do whatever God calls them to do. We all have been created by God, and we should not tell people what they can and can't not do based on their gender, on the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, their age. This is an important week that we go back and remember our history. It's not that long ago, 100 years ago, and for some, it's just maybe 35 or 40 years ago they're working to catch up. This week, let us recommit ourselves. Love your neighbor, no exception. Go out, have a great day.